Dust settled on battered leather as 94-year-old Beatrice watched a towering Hell's Angel weep over cold coffee. Society called him dangerous. She called him hungry. What left her lips next shattered his hardened soul completely, uncovering secrets buried beneath decades of blood, roaring engines, and unspoken regrets. Heat radiated off the cracked asphalt of Route 66 like a physical weight. Inside the rusty diner, an aging relic on the outskirts of Barstow, California, the air conditioner rattled a steady, dying rhythm. Beatrice Walker sat in her usual booth by the window, her frail hands wrapped around a porcelain mug of decaf. At 94, Beatrice possessed a face mapped with a century of living deep lines carved by grief, laughter, and the relentless desert sun. Her eyes, however, remained a piercing, unclouded blue, sharp enough to thread a needle and wise enough to read a room in seconds. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon. Brenda, a waitress whose apron bore faded stains from 1,000 spilled coffees, leaned against the counter, filing her nails. A couple of truck drivers spoke in low murmurs over plates of hash browns. The normalcy shattered with a sound that vibrated deep in the chest before it ever reached the ears. A deep, guttural roar announced the arrival. A custom Harley-Davidson, stripped down and painted matte black, tore into the gravel parking lot. The engine cut off, but the heavy silence that followed felt louder. Through the smudged window, Beatrice watched the rider dismount. He was a mountain of a man, standing easily over 6'3", broad-shouldered and heavy-booted. He wore faded denim and a heavy leather vest, a cut. On his back, proudly displayed in crimson and gold, was the winged death head. The top rocker read Hell's Angels, the bottom rocker, California. Inside the diner, the atmosphere instantly hardened. The truckers stopped talking. Brenda froze, her nail file hovering in midair. The reputation of the motorcycle club preceded them, especially in these isolated stretches of the Mojave. People expected violence, they expected trouble. But Beatrice just watched. The biker didn't come inside. He pulled off a heavily scuffed helmet, revealing a shaved head and a thick, graying beard that reached his collarbone. Intricate tattoos crawled up his neck, disappearing behind his ears. He looked exhausted, his shoulders, massive as they were, slumped with an invisible crushing weight. He walked over to a rusted iron table on the diner's small outdoor patio, slumped into the chair, and dropped his head into his massive, calloused hands. He sat perfectly still, alone in the sweltering 100-degree heat. "Don't even look at him, Bayer," Brenda whispered, having hurried over to the window booth. Her voice trembled slightly. "I'm not going out there. If he wants something, he can come in, but I ain't serving him on the patio. My uncle had a run-in with those Oakland boys back in the 80s. They're bad news." Beatrice didn't reply immediately. She studied the man. Most people saw the leather, the death head, the scars on his knuckles. Beatrice saw a man whose chest heaved with suppressed, ragged breaths. She noticed how his fingers trembled as he pulled a small crumpled photograph from his pocket and laid it flat on the metal table. He stared at it, completely oblivious to the brutal sun beating down on his neck. "He's not looking for trouble, Brenda," Beatrice said softly, her voice raspy but steady. "He's looking for a reason to keep breathing." "You don't know that," Brenda hissed. "He's a Hell's Angel. They don't have feelings like regular folks." "Pain does not care about the clothes you wear," Beatrice replied. She slowly slid out of her booth, her joints popping in protest. She reached for her wooden cane. "Order a chicken fried steak, mashed potatoes, extra gravy, and a large slice of cherry pie. Bear, you just ate a bowl of oatmeal. It's not for me, dear." Brenda stared in horror as Beatrice pulled 2 crumpled $20 bills from her worn leather purse and placed them on the table. "Cook it up. Put it on a heavy plate. I'll carry it up myself. I am not letting you walk out there to that animal." Brenda protested, moving to block the aisle. Beatrice stopped and locked her piercing blue eyes onto the waitress. "Brenda, I survived the Blitz in London, a transatlantic crossing in a hurricane, and 50 years of marriage to a stubborn silversmith. A sad boy on a motorcycle is not going to be my undoing. Now, get the food. 10 minutes later, carrying a tray that shook slightly in her trembling hands, Beatrice pushed open the diner's glass door. The bell chimed brightly, a jarring sound in the heavy desert air. The biker didn't flinch. He didn't even look up as her orthopedic shoes shuffled across the concrete patio. He was lost in the crumpled photograph, lost in whatever nightmare was playing out behind his dark eyes. Beatrice reached the table. The smell of hot gravy and fried meat momentarily overpowered the scent of gasoline and hot asphalt. With deliberate care, she slid the heavy ceramic plate directly over the photograph, hiding it from view. Jackson Bull Reynolds snapped his head up, his eyes flashing with sudden, violent anger. For 30 years he had worn the patch. He had bled for his brothers, fought in the dirt, and commanded respect through sheer unyielding intimidation. Nobody approached him unless invited. Nobody touched his table, and absolutely nobody covered up the last photograph he had of his little brother. He opened his mouth to unleash a string of profanities, ready to terrify whatever fool had interrupted his solitary goodbye to the world. He had a loaded revolver in his saddlebag and half a mind to ride his bike straight off the rim of the Grand Canyon by nightfall. His patience was zero, but the words died in his throat. Standing before him was a woman who looked like she could be blown away by a strong gust of wind. She wore a floral dress, a knitted cardigan despite the heat, and leaned heavily on a wooden cane. "You're blocking my picture, lady," Jackson growled, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble. He tried to sound menacing, tried to force her away with the same glare that made grown men cross the street. Beatrice didn't move. She pulled out the iron chair opposite him. It scraped loudly against the concrete. She sat down with a heavy sigh, resting both hands on her cane. "A man cannot live on sorrow and desert air," Beatrice said matter-of-factly. "Eat the steak before the gravy congeals. It's an insult to the cow otherwise." Jackson blinked. He looked from the steaming food to the tiny, wrinkled woman. "Are you out of your mind? Do you know who I am?" "I know you are a man sitting in 100-degree heat wearing a leather jacket," she replied smoothly, "which tells me you are either very cold or you are trying to hide from the world. Based on your shoulders, I'd say it's the latter. Eat." Jackson was completely thrown. He was used to fear, aggression, or groveling. He was not used to being ordered around like a disobedient toddler. A low, humorless chuckle escaped his lips. "I ain't hungry, Grandma. Take your plate and go back inside before your waitress friend has a heart attack. She's been staring out that window like I'm going to burn the place down." "If you were going to burn it down, you would have done it already," Beatrice countered. "Instead, you're crying." Jackson stiffened. His jaw clenched tight enough to crack a tooth. "I don't cry. Your face is wet," she pointed out calmly. Jackson furiously wiped his cheek with the back of his massive hand, smearing a mixture of road dust and tears across his skin. He felt exposed, stripped of his armor. "Look," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "I appreciate the charity, but you need to leave. Now, I'm not good company. I bring bad luck and worse consequences." "I have outlived everyone I ever loved," Beatrice said, her voice dropping its strict tone, softening into something deeply empathetic. "My luck ran out a long time ago. Eat." Something in her tone of profound shared grief broke through his defenses. Jackson picked up the fork. His massive, tattooed fingers dwarfed the cheap metal utensil. He cut a piece of the steak and put it in his mouth. He hadn't eaten in 3 days. The taste of actual food sent a sudden jolt through his exhausted system. As he ate, Beatrice watched him quietly. Her eyes traced the ink on his skin, the heavy leather of his cut, and finally, they rested on his right hand. Gripping the fork was a thick set of fingers covered in scars, but on his index finger rested a heavy, intricately carved silver ring. It wasn't the standard stainless steel biker jewelry you could buy at a roadside rally. It was a masterpiece of old-world silversmithing. A snarling wolf's head, its eyes set with tiny, raw black onyx stones, intertwined with a thick chain of thorns. Beatrice stopped breathing. Her heart, which had beat a steady, slow rhythm for decades, suddenly hammered against her ribs. She leaned forward, squinting to make sure the harsh sun wasn't playing tricks on her aging eyes. "Where did you get that ring?" she asked. Her voice was suddenly breathless, stripped of its previous commanding tone. Jackson stopped chewing. He glanced at his hand, then back to her. His guard slammed back up. "None of your business." "I need to know," she insisted, her knuckles turning white as she gripped her cane. "Please." Jackson swallowed heavily. "It belonged to my grandfather. He passed it to my dad passed it to my younger brother. My brother." Jackson choked on the words, his throat tightening. He tapped the edge of the plate, gesturing to the hidden photograph underneath. "My brother died last week. Rival club. Ambush in Bakersfield. They took him out. I pulled this off his hand at the morgue." Beatrice closed her eyes, a solitary tear escaping and tracing a path down her wrinkled cheek. "I am so sorry for your loss, but I know that ring." Jackson scoffed, shaking his head. "No, you don't. This is custom. One of a kind. My grandfather got it back in the 50s up in Oakland." "Oakland," Beatrice breathed out. 1959. Your grandfather. Was his name William? Did they call him Wild Bill?" Jackson dropped his fork. It clattered loudly against the ceramic plate. The blood drained from his face beneath his tan and road dirt. He stared at the 94-year-old woman as if she had just materialized from thin air. "How do you know that?" Jackson demanded, his voice a low, threatening rumble. He leaned across the table, his sheer size blocking out the sun. "Nobody knows that name outside the charter." "How do you know about Wild Bill?" "Because," Beatrice said, her voice trembling but filled with an incredible, devastating warmth, "my husband, Arthur Walker, crafted that ring." Jackson froze. The anger melted into pure, unadulterated shock. "Arthur was a silversmith," Beatrice continued, her eyes locked onto the wolf's head ring. "A master of his craft. We lived in Oakland. We had a son named David. He was 16, reckless, mixed up with the wrong crowd. One night, David got caught up in a brawl outside a tavern. A man was badly hurt. The police were coming. David was terrified, weeping, facing years in a juvenile penitentiary that would have destroyed him. Not too good. Jackson's breath hitched. He knew the law of his family, but hearing it from this stranger in the middle of nowhere felt like a ghost story coming to life. "Your grandfather, William," Beatrice said, pointing a shaking finger at the ring. "He was a wild man, a terrifying man to look at, but he saw my boy crying in the alley. William stepped forward. When the police arrived, William took the blame. He told them he started the fight. He told them David was just a bystander. He went to prison," Jackson whispered, the family history aligning perfectly with the words of this fragile old woman. "He served 4 years in San Quentin." "He did," Beatrice confirmed, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "He traded 4 years of his life to save a boy he didn't even know. When he got out, my husband Arthur tracked him down. We didn't have much money, but Arthur had his silver. He spent 3 weeks carving that wolf. He gave it to William and said, 'The Walker family owes you a debt that blood and silver can never repay.'" Jackson stared at his hand. He had worn the ring for 3 days, carrying it as a symbol of his murdered brother, a symbol of revenge. He had been planning to ride back to Bakersfield tonight. He was planning to find the men who killed his brother and take as many of them to hell with him as he could before the bullets took him down. "Your brother," Beatrice said softly, reaching across the table. She didn't hesitate. She placed her tiny, liver-spotted hand directly over Jackson's massive, tattooed knuckles. "He died." We died, and you are sitting here preparing to throw your life away in his name. You're planning to die tonight, aren't you?" Jackson couldn't speak. His throat felt like it was packed with broken glass. The tough, untouchable Hell's Angel, a man feared across the West Coast, felt his chest heave. "William gave up his freedom so my son could have a future," Beatrice said, her grip surprisingly strong on his hand. "Do not disrespect your grandfather's legacy by throwing your future into a grave of vengeance. The Walker family debt is not paid. I am here to collect it, Jackson. You are going to live." At the sound of his reel, name a name she could not possibly have known unless she truly knew his grandfather's history, the dam broke. Jackson ripped his hand away, covered his face, and let out a sob so profound, so agonizingly deep, that it silenced the desert wind. Heavy, ragged sobs tore through the suffocating desert heat. Inside the diner, Brenda dropped a ceramic coffee pot. It shattered against the linoleum floor, splashing dark liquid across her shoes, but she did not look down. Her eyes, wide with sheer disbelief, remained locked on the patio. The most terrifying man she had ever seen, a patched Hell's Angel who looked capable of snapping a neck with bare hands, was weeping openly across a rusted table from a 94-year-old widow. Jackson leaned forward until his forehead pressed against the hot iron of the table. He didn't care about the grease, the dirt, or the fact that any passing car could see his moment of absolute vulnerability. For 30 years, the club had been his religion. The cut on his back was his armor. But Beatrice had reached straight through the leather, through the muscle and bone, and grasped his soul. Beatrice did not pull her hand away. She gently stroked the scarred knuckles resting near the plate of cooling chicken fried steak. "Tell me about him," Beatrice commanded softly. It wasn't a request. Jackson took a shuddering breath, sitting up slowly. His eyes were red, the tough exterior entirely stripped away. He looked for the first time, his actual age a tired, battered 50-year-old man who'd seen too much asphalt and too much blood. His name was Liam, Jackson rasped, his voice catching. He was 10 years younger. He didn't belong in the life, Mrs. Walker. He was a mechanic, a genius with engines. He only patched in because he worshipped me. I was his older brother, the big bad enforcer. I brought him into this world. I handed him the cut. Jackson's hands began to tremble violently. 3 days ago, the Iron Phantom's arrival syndicate moving product through our territory cornered him behind a garage in Bakersfield. They didn't even give him a chance to fight. They gunned him down. 6 men against 1 mechanic holding a wrench. They took his life, and they left him bleeding out in the grease. Now, action. "And you were going to Bakersfield tonight to kill them," Beatrice stated, reading the dark, fatalistic resignation in his posture. "I have a canvas duffel bag in my saddlebag," Jackson whispered, staring at his boots, "loaded with enough firepower to level their clubhouse. I wasn't planning on coming out of that building, Mrs. Walker. My life ended in that alley with Liam. My only purpose left was to make sure those 6 men never drew breath again. Blood for blood. It's the only law I know." Beatrice tapped her wooden cane against the concrete. "Blood for blood is a bankrupt philosophy. It leaves everyone bleeding, Jackson. Let me tell you what your grandfather's sacrifice bought. Let me tell you the true law of consequence." Jackson looked up, his dark eyes locked onto her pale blue ones. "When William went to San Quentin for a crime he didn't commit, he didn't just save my son David from a cage," Beatrice said, a voice echoing with fierce pride. "He saved everything David would become. David finished high school. He went to Stanford. He went to medical school. My son, the boy your grandfather protected, became a pediatric cardiothoracic surgeon in Los Angeles." Jackson's breath hitched. "Do you comprehend what I am saying?" Beatrice asked, leaning in closer, the intensity in her voice cutting through the humid air. "David spent 40 years operating on the hearts of premature infants. He saved thousands of children. Thousands of families got to keep their babies because of your grandfather. William traded 4 years of his life in a concrete cell, and in return thousands of lives were spared. That is the legacy of the blood in your veins. That is the weight of the silver on your finger. Jackson stared at the wolf ring. The onyx eyes seemed to stare back at him, holding the immense crushing weight of history. He had worn it as a symbol of toughness, a biker heirloom. He had never known the true story. His father had only told him that his grandfather earned it from a rich man in Oakland. He never knew it was a monument to profound, selfless grace. And now, Beatrice continued, her tone dropping into a sharp reprimand, you want to take the life that William passed down to you, the legacy of a man who traded his freedom for the future, and throw it away in a hail of bullets for 6 miserable cowards in Bakersfield? You think that honors Liam? You think that honors William? What else is there? Jackson cried out, his voice cracking, the desperation agonizing to witness. He was my brother. It's my fault he was there. I have nothing left. That is a lie, Beatrice snapped, pointing a frail finger at his chest. There is always something left. Why was Liam alone behind that garage, Jackson? You said he was a mechanic. You said he worshipped you. Why was he off his guard? Jackson swallowed hard, looking away. The deepest, most painful secret of all clawed its way up his throat. Because he was leaving, Jackson choked out. He had packed his tools. He stripped his club patches off his vest an hour before he died. He was meeting a girl, a waitress from Portland. She's 4 months pregnant. Beatrice's eyes widened. A heavy, profound silence fell over the patio, broken only by the distant, lonesome wail of a freight train. He was trying to get out to be a father, Jackson wept, burying his face in his hands. He called me that morning. He begged me to come with him. I called him a coward. I told him he was turning his back on his real family. That was the last thing I ever said to him. 2 hours later, he was dead. The desert wind picked up, swirling dust around the rusted legs of the table. Inside the diner, Brenda had quietly cleaned up the broken coffee pot, wiping away tears of her own. She couldn't hear the words being spoken outside, but she could see the absolute devastation radiating from the giant in leather and the unyielding pillar of strength sitting across from him in a floral cardigan. Beatrice reached into her purse and pulled out a clean linen handkerchief. She pressed it into Jackson's massive hand. "Wipe your face," she said firmly. Jackson obeyed, the rough linen absorbing the tears and grime. He looked at Beatrice, utterly lost. A soldier whose entire war had just been rendered meaningless. "You called him a coward," Beatrice said, her voice devoid of judgment, holding only the stark truth. "But it takes far more courage to build a life than to destroy one. Liam was doing the bravest thing a man can do. He was stepping into the unknown to protect his child." Jackson nodded slowly, the truth of her words piercing his guilt-ridden conscience. "If you go to Bakersfield tonight and die," Beatrice asked, her blue eyes piercing his soul, "who protects that girl in Portland? Who provides for Liam's child? Who is going to tell that baby what kind of man their father truly was? A rival motorcycle gang? The police? Or the uncle who loved him enough to let his vengeance die so his brother's legacy could live?" Jackson stared at the crumpled photograph on the table. It was a picture of him and Liam smiling outside a roadside bar. Liam looked so young, so full of life. He didn't look like a gangster. He looked like a father. "Vengeance is a lazy man's grief, Jackson," Beatrice whispered. "It is the easiest path to take. Living with the pain, carrying the memory forward, dedicating your life to raising a child that isn't yours, that is the hardest road. That requires the strength of a giant. That requires the blood of Wild Bill." Jackson looked down at his vest. The crimson and gold death head suddenly felt incredibly heavy. It felt like a chain around his neck. He had bled for the club. He had given them his youth, his sweat, and his loyalty. But the club hadn't saved his brother. The club wouldn't save his unborn niece or nephew. Slowly, Jackson reached out and picked up the fork. The chicken fried steak was cold, the gravy completely congealed. He ate a massive bite anyway. He chewed mechanically, swallowing the cold, heavy food. He ate half the plate in silence, gathering his strength, pulling himself back together piece by agonizing piece. When he finished, he set the fork down carefully. He reached into the inner pocket of his heavy leather coat. For a terrifying second, Beatrice thought he was reaching for a weapon. Instead, he pulled out a razor-sharp hunting knife. Without a word, Jackson wedged the blade under the thick stitching of the Hell's Angels topper on his chest. With a violent, tearing sound, he ripped the patch away from the leather. He did the same to the bottom rocker, and finally he reached around and slashed the threads holding the massive winged death head to his back. He placed the severed blood-red patches in a pile on the rusted table. To leave the cub without permission was a death sentence. To strip your own patches was an unforgivable offense in his world. But as Jackson looked at Beatrice, the fear was gone. The suicidal resignation had vanished. In its place was a quiet, terrifying resolve. "The debt is acknowledged, Mrs. Walker," Jackson said, his deep voice steady and resolute. "And the debt will be paid." He stood up. He towered over the table, blocking the sun once more. But he no longer looked like a harbinger of violence. He reached down and gently slid the crumpled photograph of him and Leon toward Beatrice. "Keep him for me," Jackson said softly. "I don't need the picture anymore. I know where I'm going." Beatrice carefully picked up the photograph and placed it inside her purse. She smiled, a radiant, beautiful expression that made her look 70 years younger. "Drive safe, Jackson. Oregon is a long ride. Make sure you buy a heavier jacket. Babies don't like the cold." Jackson turned and walked away from the patio. He strode over to his matte black Harley. He unlatched the heavy leather saddlebag, reached inside, and hauled out a massive, heavy olive-green canvas duffel bag. The metallic clinking inside was unmistakable. He carried the bag to the diner's industrial dumpster, threw open the plastic lid, and tossed the bag inside. It hit the bottom with a thunderous crash. He threw his leg over the bike, turned the key, and kicked the starter. The engine roared to life, shattering the quiet desert afternoon. He didn't look back at the diner. He didn't look back at the pile of patches sitting on the table. He kicked the bike into gear and tore out of the parking lot, turning the front wheel sharply to the north. Beatrice sat quietly on the patio, finishing her decaf coffee. Randa slowly pushed the glass door open, stepping out into the heat, staring at the dust settling on the highway. Bane, Brenda whispered, looking at the torn patches left on the table. "What on earth just happened?" Beatrice picked up her cane and slowly pushed herself up from the chair. She looked out toward the northern horizon, a gentle smile playing on her lips. "Just a boy," Beatrice said softly, adjusting her floral cardigan. "Learning how to be a man. Sometimes the greatest acts of courage aren't fought with fists, but with forgiveness." Beatrice and Jackson's incredible encounter reminds us that true legacy is built on sacrifice and love, not vengeance. If this real-life tale of redemption moved your heart, please smash that like button. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder of humanity's hidden grace. And don't forget to subscribe for more unforgettable storytelling. What happens when a high school kid risks his own life to save a helpless, battered old man from a brutal mugging? He expects a quiet thank you. He absolutely does not expect the most notorious motorcycle club in the world to show up. This is a story of blood, ironclad loyalty, and the Hell's Angels. The neon sign of the Starlight Diner buzzed with a relentless, maddening hum, flickering against the rain-slicked pavement of Route 9 in the dead of a Tuesday night. It was 2:15 a.m. 17-year-old Leo Harrison wiped down the laminate counter for the fourth time, his eyes burning with exhaustion. Leo wasn't supposed to be working the graveyard shift.
He had a calculus exam in exactly 6 hours, but his mother's medical bills were piling up on the kitchen table like a mountain he couldn't climb, and the diner's manager paid under the table for the hours after midnight. Aside from Leo, the diner was mostly a ghost town. In the corner booth sat the only customer, an old man named Arthur. Leo didn't know his last name, but Arthur had been coming in every night for the past week. He was a frail-looking man in his late 60s, wearing a faded, oversized flannel shirt, frayed denim, and worn-out engineer boots. He had a scruffy, salt-and-pepper beard and hands that shook slightly as he lifted his porcelain coffee mug. Despite his ragged appearance, there was a quiet dignity about him. He never complained, always tipped a crisp $5 bill on a $2 coffee, and spent hours staring out the rain-streaked window into the dark parking lot. Leo poured the last of the decaf into Arthur's mug. "You heading home soon? Arthur Storm's getting worse." Arthur looked up, his pale blue eyes carrying a heavy, unspoken exhaustion. "Soon enough, kid. Just waiting out the worst of it. The bones don't like the damp much anymore." As he reached into his pocket to pull out his wallet, Arthur's flannel sleeve rode up. Leo caught a brief glimpse of a faded, blown-out tattoo on his forearm, skulls and wings, indistinguishable from decades of sun and age. But what caught the attention of the wrong people was the wallet. It was thick, bursting with cash. Sitting a few booths down, previously unnoticed by Leo, were two men, Brad Miller and Greg Daly. They were local fixtures in the worst way possible: petty thieves, meth heads, and opportunists who scavenged the outskirts of town looking for easy prey. Leo saw Brad nudge Greg, their eyes locked on Arthur's hands. 10 minutes later, Arthur slowly stood up, left his customary $5 bill on the table, and shuffled out the glass front doors into the pouring rain. Leo watched him go, a sudden pit forming in his stomach. He glanced at the booth where Brad and Greg had been sitting. It was empty. They had slipped out the side door. "Hey, boss, I gotta take the trash out," Leo shouted to the cook in the back. Without waiting for an answer, Leo grabbed the heavy steel mag-light flashlight from beneath the cash register, kept there for emergencies, and pushed through the back door into the freezing alleyway. The rain was deafening, bouncing off the metal dumpsters. At first, Leo saw nothing but shadows. Then, he heard the sickening thud of bone hitting brick, followed by a wheezing gasp. He broke into a sprint, rounding the corner of the brick building. Under the flickering amber light of a busted street lamp, he saw them. Brad had Arthur pinned against the rough brick wall, his forearm pressed brutally into the old man's throat. Greg was ripping through Arthur's pockets, tearing the flannel shirt in the process. "Give it up, old man. Where's the wallet?" Greg snarled, pulling a switchblade from his pocket and flicking it open with a sharp click. The steel caught the dim light. Arthur wasn't begging. Despite the arm crushing his windpipe, he was staring at Brad with an eerie, icy calm. "You boys are making a mistake," Arthur rasped, blood trickling from his split lip. "A permanent one." "Shut up," Brad roared, drawing his fist back to strike the old man in the face. Leo didn't think. If he had stopped to weigh the odds, a skinny 17-year-old high school student against two desperate, armed criminals, he would have run back inside and dialed 911. But seeing the blade, and seeing the blood on Arthur's face, a primal surge of adrenaline took over. "Hey!" Leo screamed, his voice cracking slightly but echoing loud enough over the rain. Brad and Greg whipped their heads around. "Back off, I already called the cops," Leo lied, raising the heavy metal mag light. His hands were shaking, but he planted his feet firmly on the wet asphalt. Greg laughed, stepping away from Arthur and twirling the knife. "Look at this. The diner boy wants to be a hero. Turn around and walk back inside. Kid, this ain't your business." "Let him go," Leo demanded, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Brad sneered and shoved Arthur violently to the ground. The old man hit the wet pavement hard, groaning as his head struck a puddle. Brad cracked his knuckles and took a step toward Leo. "I'm gonna break your jaw, kid." Brad lunged. He was fast, swinging a wild right hook aimed straight at Leo's temple. But Leo was quicker. He ducked under the wild punch, gripping the heavy flashlight with both hands, and swung it upward with everything he had. The solid aluminum barrel connected with Brad's jaw with a horrific crack. Brad's eyes rolled back, and he dropped to the asphalt like a sack of cement, entirely unconscious. Greg froze, staring at his friend on the ground. The smirk vanished from his face, replaced by a feral, cornered animal rage. He raised the switchblade, stepping over Brad's body. "I'm gonna gut you for that." Leo backed up, raising the flashlight defensively, knowing he couldn't dodge a knife. The cops are literally a minute away, sirens. Man, listen. It was a bluff, but the distant sound of a semi-truck air horn on the highway played right into it. Greg hesitated, glancing toward the street. He looked back at Leo, committing his face to memory. "You're dead, kid," Greg spat, his voice pure venom. "You hear me? You're a walking corpse." He grabbed Brad by the collar, dragging his groggy, moaning friend toward the darkness of the adjacent lot. Leo stood frozen until they completely disappeared into the rain. The adrenaline drained from his system instantly, leaving him gasping for air, his knees threatening to buckle. He dropped the flashlight and rushed over to Arthur. "Arthur, are you okay? Don't move. I'm calling an ambulance." Leo fumbled in his apron for his phone. Suddenly, a surprisingly strong hand gripped Leo's wrist. It was Arthur. The old man pushed himself up into a sitting position, wiping the blood from his mouth with the back of his hand. "No cops, no ambulances," Arthur said, his voice surprisingly steady for a man who had just been beaten. "But you're bleeding. They had a knife." "I said no cops. Leo," Arthur repeated, using the boy's name for the very first time. He looked directly into Leo's eyes, and for a second, the frail old man vanished, replaced by someone incredibly hardened and dangerous. "I don't involve the law in my affairs." Leo helped him to his feet. Arthur brushed the dirt off his ruined flannel. He reached into his pocket, the one Greg hadn't managed to empty, and pulled out a heavy, tarnished silver coin. He pressed it into Leo's palm. It had a strange insignia etched into it, a winged skull wearing a motorcycle helmet. "You're a brave kid, Leo," Arthur said quietly. "Stupid, but brave. You shouldn't have risked your neck for me." "I couldn't just watch them hurt you," Leo said, looking down at the heavy coin. "Keep that in your pocket," Arthur instructed, his tone dead serious. "If those scavengers come back for you, and they will, you show that to whoever you need to. You tell them Arthur sent you. You understand?" Before Leo could ask what that meant. Arthur turned and limped away into the downpour, leaving Leo alone in the alley with nothing but a bloody lip, a bruised flashlight, and a strange silver coin. The paranoia set in the very next morning. Every time the diner door chimed, Leo's heart leaped into his throat. He jumped at shadows walking home from school. He constantly checked the rearview mirror of his rusted 2004 Honda Civic, convinced a truck was tailing him. Greg's final words, "You're a walking corpse," echoed in his head on a relentless loop. Arthur didn't return to the Starlight Diner. Wednesday passed. Then Thursday. The corner booth remained empty, completely devoid of the quiet old man and his decaf coffee. Leo kept the heavy silver coin in his right pocket at all times, rubbing his thumb over the etched skull whenever his anxiety spiked. He tried researching the symbol on the internet between classes, but the results were vague, mostly pointing to vintage military insignias or obscure biker culture. He convinced himself it was just an old war token from a grateful veteran. By Friday night, the fear had begun to morph into a dull ache of exhaustion. It was payday, and Leo was pulling a double shift to make up for the hours he missed studying for his exams. At 3:15 a.m., the manager finally locked the front doors, flipping the neon sign to "Closed." "Good work tonight, Leo," the manager mumbled, tossing a white envelope of cash onto the counter. "See you Sunday." Leo pocketed the envelope, grabbed his backpack, and stepped out the back door into the suffocating humidity of the night. The rain from earlier in the week had vanished, leaving behind a thick, suffocating fog that rolled off the nearby highway. The parking lot was desolate, illuminated by only one flickering sodium bulb. Leo walked toward his Civic, pulling his keys from his pocket. He was 10 feet away when he noticed the shadow standing by his driver's side door. He stopped dead in his tracks. "Hey there! Hero!" A voice hissed from the darkness. Greg stepped into the dim orange light. His face was twisted into an ugly, triumphant sneer. In his right hand, he held a heavy steel tire iron. Leo immediately backed up, looking for a way to bolt back to the diner, but the heavy metal security door had already clicked shut and locked behind him. "Going somewhere," another voice called out. From behind the dumpsters. Brad emerged. His jaw was heavily bruised, swollen to twice its normal size, and his eyes were dark with malice. But they weren't alone. 2 more men stepped out from the shadows near the edge of the lot, blocking the exit to the street. They were large, muscular, and carrying baseball bats, 4 against 1. "I told you, kid," Greg said, casually tapping the tire iron against the hood of Leo's car. Smack. A dent appeared in the cheap metal. "I told you you were dead. Did you really think I'd let some little diner brat crack my boy's jaw and walk away?" "Take my money," Leo said, his voice trembling as he reached into his pocket, pulling out his white pay envelope. "It's $300. Just take it and let me go." Brad laughed, a wet, ugly sound. "We're gonna take your money anyway, kid. But first, we're gonna break both your legs so you can't run out to any more alleys." The 4 men began to close in, forming a tight circle around Leo. The air felt suffocating. Leo's hand drifted to his right pocket, his fingers wrapping around Arthur's silver coin. It felt useless now. A chunk of metal wasn't going to stop 4 men with weapons. He braced himself, raising his fists in a desperate, futile attempt to protect his face. Greg lunged, swinging the tire iron. It struck Leo in the ribs with a sickening crunch. Fire exploded in Leo's side, and he collapsed to the asphalt, gasping for air that wouldn't come. Brad stepped up and delivered a brutal kick to Leo's stomach, sending him rolling onto his back. "Hold him down," Greg commanded, raising the tire iron high above his head, aiming directly for Leo's kneecap. Leo squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for the bone-shattering impact. But the blow never came. Instead, a sound tore through the heavy fog. It wasn't a siren. It was a deep, guttural, deafening roar. It sounded like thunder erupting from the concrete itself. Greg froze, looking toward the street. The ground beneath them literally began to vibrate. Out of the thick, grey fog, twin headlights pierced the darkness. Then another pair. And another. 5 massive, custom-built Harley-Davidson motorcycles roared into the Starlight Diner parking lot in a tight, disciplined V formation. Their engines were deafening, a mechanical symphony of raw horsepower that drowned out everything else. They didn't just pull in, they swarmed the area, completely blocking the only exit and trapping the 4 thugs inside the lot. The bikes killed their engines simultaneously, the sudden silence ringing louder than the noise. The riders kicked down their kickstands in unison. They were massive men, broad-shouldered and imposing, wearing heavily worn leather cuts over denim jackets. But it was the patch on their backs that made the blood drain entirely from Greg's face. A winged skull wearing a motorcycle helmet. The exact same insignia etched onto the coin in Leo's pocket. The rockers above and below the skull read 2 words that commanded absolute terror and respect on the streets: Hell's Angels. The leader of the group stepped off his customized road glide. He was a mountain of a man in his late 30s, with a thick beard, intricate tattoos crawling up his neck, and eyes that looked like black ice. On the front of his leather vest, a small patch read President. He didn't rush. He walked with a terrifying, measured calmness toward the group, his heavy boots crunching against the gravel. The other 4 angels flanked him, their hands casually resting near their waistbands, their expressions devoid of any mercy. Brad dropped his baseball bat. It clattered against the asphalt. He took a terrified step back. The president stopped a few feet from Greg, who was still holding the tire iron, though his hand was now visibly shaking. "You fellas seem to be lost," the president said. His voice was a deep, gravelly baritone that didn't need to be loud to be completely dominant. "We ain't got no problem with the club. Man," Greg stammered, raising his free hand in surrender. "This is personal, just taking care of a local dispute." The president looked past Greg, his eyes locking onto Leo, who was still on the ground, clutching his bleeding ribs. The president's expression remained entirely unreadable. "Is your name Leo?" the president asked. Leo, coughing and wincing in pain, managed a weak nod. "Yeah." The president turned his attention back to Greg. The air in the parking lot seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You see, that's where you're wrong," the president said softly, stepping directly into Greg's personal space. "You don't have a local dispute. You have a problem with me." "Why?" Greg stuttered, realizing how catastrophically out of his depth he was. The president smiled, a cold, predatory baring of teeth. "Because earlier this week, you put your hands on my father, and the boy you're about to hit, he saved his life." The president cracked his knuckles, the sound like breaking branches in the silent night. "My name is Jackson. Arthur is my dad. And tonight, you boys are going to learn what happens when you touch family." The silence that followed Jackson's revelation was absolute, save for the rhythmic, metallic ticking of the cooling Harley-Davidson engines. The heavy fog seemed to thicken, pressing down on the parking lot like a suffocating blanket. Greg's face, previously twisted in arrogant malice, completely crumbled. The tire iron slipped from his trembling fingers, hitting the wet asphalt with a hollow, pathetic clang. Brad, still nursing his bruised jaw, was practically hyperventilating, his eyes darting wildly for an escape route that simply did not exist. The other 2 hired thugs with baseball bats slowly lowered their weapons, utterly paralyzed by the reputation of the men standing before them. "Jackson, please," Greg choked out, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whine. "We didn't know. We swear to God, we had no idea he was your father." Jackson didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Ignorance isn't an excuse, Greg. You preyed on an old man. You put a knife in his face for a few crumpled bills. And then you brought 4 men to beat a high school kid to death to cover your bruised ego. Jackson took one deliberate step forward. That tells me everything I need to know about what kind of men you are. He gave a barely perceptible nod to the 4 massive angels flanking him. It was not a chaotic brawl. It was a terrifyingly systematic, utterly silent dismantling. The angels moved with a brutal, synchronized efficiency, born from decades of surviving the harshest environments. Jackson didn't even lift a finger. He simply turned his back on the thugs as the muffled sounds of bone meeting leather and desperate, gasping pleas echoed through the fog. It was over in less than 60 seconds. Greg, Brad, and their 2 accomplices were left crumpled on the asphalt, groaning in agonizing pain, utterly broken but alive. Jackson walked over to where Leo was struggling to sit up against his rusted Honda Civic. The biker crouched down, his massive frame dwarfing the 17-year-old. The terrifying aura he had projected moments ago softened just a fraction. "You got a broken rib, kid," Jackson said, his gravelly voice oddly gentle as he inspected the way Leo was clutching his side. "Maybe 2. I'll just go to the hospital," Leo stammered, wincing as a sharp spike of pain shot through his chest. "No hospitals," Jackson replied firmly, echoing his father's exact words from nights ago. "Hospitals ask questions. They call the cops. The cops start sniffing around. And suddenly you're wrapped up in a police report with these 4 bottom feeders. You don't want that kind of heat in your life." Jackson extended a large, calloused hand. Leo hesitated for only a second before grasping it. Jackson pulled him to his feet with effortless strength. "My dad said he gave you something," Jackson said, his dark eyes locking onto Leo's. "Let me see it." With trembling fingers, Leo reached into his right pocket and pulled out the heavy silver coin. He held it out in his palm. Jackson stared at the winged skull insignia for a long moment. He reached out and traced the edge of the coin with his thumb. "Do you have any idea what this is?" "Leo," Arthur said. "He said to show it if those guys came back," Leo whispered. "It's called a Reaper's Mark," Jackson explained, his voice thick with reverence. "It's cast from the silver of melted-down motorcycle parts. My old man is a founding member of the Oakland Charter. He doesn't just hand these out. In fact, I've only seen him give one away once in my entire life, and that was to a man who took a bullet for him 30 years ago." Jackson closed Leo's fingers over the coin, pressing it back into the boy's chest. "When you hold that coin, you are a friend of the Hells Angels. It means you have the absolute protection of this club. Anyone who touches you, touches us. Greg and his crew just learned that the hard way." Leo looked past Jackson to the bruised, defeated men groaning on the ground. The sheer reality of the situation was crashing over him like a tidal wave. He had saved a stranger, and in return, he had accidentally enlisted an army. "Come on," Jackson said, tossing a set of keys to one of his men. "Bobby is going to drive your car to your place. You're riding with me. We have a private doctor who handles club business. He's going to tape those ribs up, and then we're taking you home." Leo didn't argue. He climbed onto the back of Jackson's roaring road glide, clutching the silver coin in his pocket as the convoy of Harleys tore out of the diner parking lot, leaving the Starlight Diner and his nightmare far behind in the rearview mirror. The club's doctor, an older, silent man operating out of a spotless basement clinic on the edge of town, taped Leo's ribs tight, and handed him a bottle of prescription painkillers without asking a single question. By the time the convoy pulled up to Leo's rundown apartment complex, the sun was just beginning to bleed over the horizon, painting the smoggy sky in bruised shades of purple and orange. Bobby handed Leo his Honda keys with a stoic nod. Jackson walked Leo to his front door. The apartment was cramped, the peeling paint on the door a stark reminder of the crushing poverty Leo and his mother lived in. "You rest up, kid," Jackson said, adjusting his leather cut. "You don't go back to that diner for a week. Understood?" "I have to," Leo said, a wave of panic washing over him. "I can't miss work. Jackson, my mum, she's got cancer treatments. The bills are piling up. If I miss a week of pay, we lose this apartment. We lose everything." Jackson paused. His dark eyes scanned the dilapidated hallway, taking in the reality of Leo's desperate life. He didn't offer any empty words of pity. He simply nodded slowly. "Get some sleep, Leo," Jackson said quietly. He turned on his heel and walked back to his idling motorcycle, disappearing into the early morning light. For the next 4 days, Leo lived in a haze of painkillers and anxiety. He stayed locked in his apartment, terrified of the mounting debt, terrified of his boss firing him, and terrified for his mother's health. He kept expecting the police to knock on his door regarding the assault at the diner, but the knock never came. On Wednesday afternoon, the phone rang. It was the billing department at St. Jude's Memorial Hospital, where his mother was receiving her oncology treatments. Leo answered with a heavy heart, fully expecting the collection agency threats he was so used to hearing. "Mr. Harrison," the woman on the line asked cheerfully. "I'm calling regarding your mother's outstanding balance." I know. Leo sighed, rubbing his temples. "I just need a few more weeks to get the payment plan." "Oh, no, sweetheart, you don't understand," the woman interrupted. "I'm calling to inform you that the account has been settled. The entire balance." Leo froze. The phone nearly slipped from his grasp. "What? That's $34,000. That's impossible." "It was paid in full yesterday morning," she confirmed, typing loudly on her keyboard. "A cashier's check was hand-delivered to our administrative office." "By who?" Leo breathed, tears suddenly pricking the corners of his eyes. "The donor requested anonymity," she replied, though the gentleman who dropped it off was quite memorable. He was wearing a rather large leather vest and rode a very loud motorcycle. The paperwork was filed under a charitable trust named the Reaper's Mark Foundation. Leo slowly hung up the phone. He pulled the tarnished silver coin from his pocket, the weight of it suddenly feeling heavier, immensely warmer in his palm. The Hells Angels hadn't just protected his life, they had given him his future back. A month later, a cool autumn breeze swept through town. Leo, fully healed and back on his feet, walked into the Starlight Diner for the midnight shift. His mother was resting comfortably at home, her treatments fully covered. He no longer jumped at shadows. He no longer checked his rearview mirror. At exactly 2:15 a.m., the glass door chimed. Leo looked up from wiping the counter. Walking through the door, wearing a pristine new flannel shirt and the same scruffy beard, was Arthur. He moved a little slower, perhaps favoring his left leg a bit more, but his pale blue eyes were as sharp as ever. Flanking him, standing like a silent, towering guardian, was Jackson. The diner fell dead silent. The few patrons in the booths instinctively lowered their eyes, sensing the overwhelming presence of the men who had just walked in. Arthur slowly shuffled over to his usual corner booth and sat down. Jackson stood by the doorway, his arms crossed, giving Leo a subtle, knowing nod. Leo smiled. He grabbed a fresh porcelain mug, filled it to the brim with hot decaf, and walked over to the corner booth. He placed it gently on the table. "On the house tonight, Arthur," Leo said softly. Arthur looked up, a rare, genuine smile cracking through his weathered face. He reached out and gave Leo's wrist a firm squeeze. "Good to see you, kid," Arthur rasped. "Keep that coin safe." "Always," Leo replied. He walked back behind the counter. No longer just a scared kid working the graveyard shift. He was the boy who stood up in the dark, the boy who drew the line, and the boy who earned the unbreakable loyalty of the most dangerous men on asphalt. If this story of raw loyalty, immense bravery, and unexpected brotherhood kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button right now. Don't forget to share this incredible real-life twist with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more gripping, heart-pounding stories where true justice comes from the most unlikely of places. See you in the next video.